I've always been fascinated with innovation in the Bitcoin blockchain world, because from what my understanding, and I'll be very honest, it's minimal, but it's more like just being in the room when people are talking about it, kind of learning. It's the blockchain, it's the ledger, and then the only things you're really innovating is maybe making a faster computer to be able to process. What other innovation is there?
So I guess I would think about it in terms of like, like a car, right? So every car, non-electric car has a combustion engine in it, right? Yet one could argue that like the different manufacturers and different vehicles serve very different purposes, right? Like a cement truck versus like a Honda Accord, fundamentally they're the same thing, but they serve very different purposes, right? So there's innovation in both. I think crypto has very similar properties to that example. So I think on one hand, you've got the assets themselves. So the assets, also everything's coming up in threes today, fall into three buckets, right? So you have assets like Bitcoin and Ethereum, which are store value, right? That's the digital gold we were talking about. They're not great assets to transact with because they are pretty valuable and they're changing their value actually quickly, right? So you don't necessarily want to use them to pay for something. Then you have utility tokens, right? Which are assets that were created to facilitate some sort of transaction. The best example I can give you is, you've heard of the company Ripple, probably, and their token is called XRP. But like, what does Ripple do? Why do they exist? Well, the main reason they exist is to facilitate financial transfers between companies, across borders. So XRP was developed to help facilitate that, right? Like you can think about it in terms of Uber, right? Uber has to pay, it's called 1 million drivers around the world on the 15th and the 1st, right? Or the 1st and the 15th. So they dump in the US dollars into Ripple, who then turns it into XRP. The XRP shoots out around the world, and that gets converted into the local currency on the outside. Seems like it's pretty efficient, right? That is a utility function for that asset. Now you can own it as an individual, but like it was developed for a very specific purpose. And then you have the meme coins, right? Which are not really based on anything other than popularity. And it's very hard to predict which ones are going to be popular and not. We generally don't recommend putting a lot of investment into meme coins. Yet some meme coins, Dogecoin, become a store of value, right? So sometimes they do become mainstream. Enough people buy them, their market caps increase. The innovation across all three of those is fascinating, right? Bitcoin is very expensive to use. So think about like a wire transfer fee, right? So you pay a fee to use your Bitcoin. Different assets are cheaper to use because it's easier to send them across whatever network they've been developed on. And so that's where the innovation comes into play. Again, it may not matter to Americans, but if you're in Nigeria, you really care about what it costs to use your asset to pay the babysitter or buy a pizza because you're using it in place of the Naira. You're using it as your form of currency. So you don't want to pay a huge fee. You want to pay a very low fee, right? So innovation in that space is very important to you. So that's one category. I'd say like the other category is the tokenization category, right? Which is taking real world assets or assets like securities and tokenizing them so more people get access to them or they're easier to transfer. And that does require, the development of a blockchain or a ledger, but that's just the vehicle for executing the transaction. The tokenization process itself, tons of innovation there. So I think there is quite a lot of innovation to happen. The engine structure doesn't necessarily change, but what happens around it will change.
Well, I love the example of the cars, because if you think about it, a Model T and an F1 car, I mean, obviously they're different planets,
Yeah.
but it's the theory is the same.
Correct.
Yeah.